Byline audio.
Hello and welcome to the Byline podcast from the Byline Times. It's what the papers don't say, what radio doesn't report, and what telly doesn't tell you. My name's Adrian Goldberg. This time, with the Euros in full swing, is football's world governing body FIFA about to score an own goal as it assesses the contenders for two forthcoming World Cups. The 2030 tournament looks set to take place in 6 countries across 3 continents: Morocco, Portugal and Spain, with additional matches in Argentina, Paraguay and Uruguay. What are the environmental implications of that? And what about human rights concerns in at least some of the countries involved? Morocco, for example, criminalises same-sex acts and has prosecuted journalists critical of government policy. Then there's the 2034 tournament, which is set for Saudi Arabia, a country with an appalling human rights record. We're going to hear shortly from Steve Coburn, who has just compiled a major report on both these bids for Amnesty International. But first, let's hear from Lina Al-Hathloul. Lina is a Saudi exile whose sister Loujain was jailed for campaigning for the rights of women in Saudi to drive. She spoke to me on this podcast last September.
My sister Loujain was one of the leaders of the Women to Drive campaign, because before 2018, women couldn't drive a car in Saudi. So she was leading that movement, and she was also part of the End Male Guardianship System campaign, which aims at dismantling the male guardianship in Saudi Arabia, which is basically a system of laws that consider women as a minor till the end of their lives. In 2018, when the Saudi government was about to announce the end of the ban on women driving, they arrested all the leaders of the campaign. So in March 2018, my sister was in the Emirates. They kidnapped her from the streets of the Emirates, flew her back to Saudi Arabia on a private plane, blindfolded. She was forcibly disappeared, put on a travel ban. And then a couple of months later, in May 2018, the state security, which is the Crown Prince's private police, broke into her house. They took Loujain without a warrant, without telling us where she was going. She was forcibly disappeared again. We later found out that during this period she was being tortured. And then she was held in solitary confinement for 9 months. When she was officially charged after almost a year, we found out about her charges, which are explicitly mentioning her activism, but also being in contact with diplomats from the UK, the Netherlands, and the EU. And before being charged, the public narrative of the government and the state media was to say that she's a foreign agent and that she's in contact with foreign states. But the only foreign countries that were actually named in her charges are the UK, the Netherlands, and the EU. The MBS himself, the Crown Prince, said that she's a foreign agent and that he had videos proving it in a Bloomberg interview. And of course, nothing was shown. And Loujain was later released. So just maybe to mention the fact that torture was not a mistake. It was coordinated and controlled and overseen by Saud al-Qahtani, who is the Crown Prince's right-hand man. And he was the one ordering that she gets electrocuted, waterboarded, flogged, beaten, sexually harassed. So then with the pressure, with the case of my sister gaining international attention, she was released, but she's still on a travel ban, meaning she can't leave the country. She was targeted with Pegasus, so she's always surveilled.
That's Israeli-developed software, Pegasus.
So
Yes.
Pegasus is an Israeli zero-click malware, meaning that without you clicking on any link, just because they have your phone number, they can have all the data of your phone. And Loujain was actually one of the first victims of that malware. Now she's in Saudi. We can't say she's free. She's in a bigger prison. You know, when you can't speak, when you are muzzled, when you can't express yourself, when you're not free. She is allowed to move within the Saudi borders, but she can't leave Saudi borders. And this is not only her case, it's the case of my whole family. My whole family is in a travel ban. So now, given that Saudi has become a pure police state, there are collective punishments, collective sanctions on families as well, meaning that my family, without any official decision, they're on a travel ban. I haven't seen them in over 5 years now.
That's Lina Al Hathlul, who these days is a Saudi exile living in Brussels and a member of the Al Qust Saudi human rights campaigning organisation. Let's welcome then Steve Coburn from Amnesty International. And Steve, I suppose Saudi is perhaps the obvious place to start. It has no rival bidder for the 2034 World Cup. So although FIFA is going to be assessing its credentials, it's nailed on to host the tournament.
Certainly, the process has been set up in that way that there is no actual competition to the Saudi Arabian bid at the moment. We are still keen ourselves to hold FIFA to what its own bidding regulations say, which is that there are many different criteria that any bid, including the Saudi Arabia bid, must meet, whether those are technical in relation to stadiums and transport infrastructure, or human rights criteria in relation to workers' rights, freedom of speech, women's rights, LGBT rights, and others, which are integral parts of FIFA's own bidding documents. And so if FIFA follow their own policy, they'll have to be scrutinizing Saudi Arabia on all of those issues. And according to FIFA's own documents, again, if those criteria are not met, they can reserve the right not to award the bid or to postpone that awarding until the time that those criteria are met.
I know that FIFA insists that bidders should consult with civil society organisations. So if we were looking at a civil society organisation in the area of human rights, you'd have to say that Amnesty International would be right at the top of that list. So has Saudi Arabia consulted with you or, to your knowledge, with any other civil society organisations?
No, not at all. We have shared our own concerns. We've shared our reports. We've written to the Saudi Arabian authorities and also the Football Association. We've not had any response. We've not had any feedback. Each bid has to commission what they call an independent human rights assessment. So they get a company to go and do that. And they are supposed to consult with human rights organizations, but also with trade unions, with football supporter groups, with local civil society groups. And we know, of course, that that consultation hasn't happened with us or others. And that's actually the same for both the Saudi Arabia bid and for the Morocco, Portugal and Spain bid.
Let's talk about Saudi Arabia's human rights record. We've just heard from Lena there. Her sister was imprisoned for more than 1,000 days for daring to campaign for the right for women to drive. Now, Saudi Arabia did ultimately allow women to drive, but nevertheless, for having the temerity to question Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, it seemed as though Lujain and others were punished for effectively just speaking up. And we know that other people, including a former student at Leeds University, have been jailed for tweets, simply for making tweets that are critical of the government. Just talk me through what your broader concerns are about the Saudi human rights record.
We've got a number of concerns in different areas. And actually, Lujain's case is quite revealing in the sense that, on the one hand, what is widely publicized in Saudi Arabia is there have been some reforms, for example, in women's rights, their ability to drive, to go to cinemas, to work in the recent years. And those have been heavily promoted by Saudi Arabia as proof that the country is changing, that there is progress. And there is some truth in the fact that there are some social reforms. At the same time, anyone who wishes to transgress, to challenge governments, to challenge rules, to speak out freely is being more fiercely repressed than ever before. There really has been a huge crackdown on free speech in the last 5 to 10 years. And we've seen many people who have been arrested. You mentioned Salma al-Shahab, a student from Leeds University, 27 years in prison simply for tweeting in favor of gender equality, using the hashtag end male guardianship, which is an extraordinary sentence and, of course, puts a huge amount of fear into anyone else who may wish to speak out as well. What's true to say that there is today not a single vocal human rights defender or human rights organization in Saudi Arabia. They're either in prison, in exile, or too scared to speak out. There's a real climate of fear and repression in the country. There's many other areas as well. We've spent a lot of years focusing on the issue of migrant labor rights in Qatar, for example, for the World Cup. The same issues we will see in Saudi Arabia. We've done investigations ourselves, of others, in cases of forced labor, in case of human trafficking in Saudi Arabia. They have the same labor system, kafala sponsorship, which really puts migrant workers, who are the majority of workers in the private sector, they put them hugely at risk of exploitation. And I think unless there are major reforms to Saudi Arabia's labor system, we will see forced labor at the heart of the World Cup. We will see workers dying. We will see workers not receiving their salaries. Something really big needs to happen in that area. Big problems around forced evictions, huge, enormous projects taking place in Saudi Arabia right now, including for places that will host World Cup venues. There's this huge, vast new city in the desert called Neom, people may have heard of. There was a BBC report a couple of months ago that highlighted how Saudi security forces received orders to use lethal force to clear the area of people who did not want to be removed from areas where there's been major developments. And someone was killed, others were arrested. There are still 3 people on death row from protesting against that. So there are really, really serious issues. Also to mention the criminalization of same-sex acts, the criminalization of adultery, and significant restrictions on women in terms of what they can do, how they can dress, and where they can go.
And I know that another organisation, another campaigning group called Equidem, has just released a report as well based on interviews with workers, revealing concerning patterns of abuse, workplace violence and forced labour in Saudi Arabia. So there are a number of organisations who are blowing the whistle about this, but apparently FIFA, so far anyway, has remained unmoved. If we think back to the Qatar World Cup, and many of the same concerns were raised about Qatar, one of the arguments raised was that by having the focus of the world's media on that country, by having a larger number of tourists in the country for football, that in some way that would force change, that it would encourage more openness in that society. What have we seen in Qatar since the 2022 World Cup?
I think Qatar is an interesting example to learn from, because I think there is some truth in the fact that by shining the spotlight on Qatar through the World Cup, it allowed, whether it was media organizations, trade unions, human rights groups, to kind of really put the reality of workers in particular in the spotlight in Qatar and push through reforms. What we saw in Qatar was, there was about 7 years from when the tournament was awarded by FIFA to Qatar, where there was exploitation on a massive scale, but also denial from FIFA and Qatar that really there was any problem at all. That really changed around 2016, 2017, when essentially they admit there was a major problem. Reforms were agreed with the International Labour Organization. And over the following years, you started to see changes in laws benefiting workers, whether that's a new minimum wage, new health and safety legislation, and other things like that. And they were important changes. And then they are changes that outlast the tournament. There are changes that came far too late. There are changes that were not properly implemented. So we still continue to see large-scale abuses right through the tournament, during the tournament, and after the tournament, and they continue today. The framework and the protections are better now for workers in Qatar than they were before. But workers had to go through a lot of pain to reach that point. They have not been compensated for those losses. And one of the big lessons that we have, I think, is to have these conversations and to put the safeguards in now before a bid is awarded. You don't wait until 7 years later to agree a reform process. Make it a part of the contract that if Saudi Arabia is going to have the bid, they must commit to a partnership with the International Labour Organization to reform its labour laws. It must allow free access to journalists to the country. It must provide legally binding guarantees for LGBTI fans, those kind of things that you put as part of the package before you confirm the bid, rather than waiting a few years before the tournament. And that's what we're calling for. We are not necessarily saying that Saudi Arabia should never be allowed to host the World Cup or shouldn't be allowed to bid. What we're saying is if you are going to be Saudi Arabia, you have to put these things in place, or we will see the same problems as we saw in Qatar.
And Saudi Arabia clearly doesn't want to be seen as a pariah state, but there are real issues in relation to human rights, aren't there? And going right back to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi embassy in Istanbul, which the CIA, according to leaks, believed was directly linked to Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. So I understand that you're saying that from Amnesty's point of view, you wouldn't say that Saudi Arabia should never hold the World Cup. But until there is a greater degree of accountability for specific heinous acts like that, it is difficult to hear an argument from a Western perspective in favour of Saudi Arabia hosting the World Cup.
Yeah, I think the Khashoggi case is quite interesting, and it's also quite revealing in the sense that in the aftermath of that murder, Saudi Arabia was becoming a pariah state. Major investor events and global events were being cancelled in the country, and it was losing its allies, and it was losing a lot of its diplomatic power in the world. And what you see in just 5 years later, it was almost 5 years to the week when Saudi Arabia announced that it was going to bid for the 2024 World Cup in a sole bid. So that's a remarkable transformation of soft power and diplomacy in that 5 years. And sport has been really, really central to that, whether that's boxing, golf, football, Newcastle United, and then the World Cup bids. And it's been very central to that. So, I think we know why Saudi Arabia wants to do this. It's about global positioning, it's about soft power, it's about projecting itself. And we need to highlight what is still problematic in the kingdom. But most importantly, is to try and make sure FIFA upholds its own human rights policies to use this opportunity, if it can, to leverage really meaningful, long-lasting reform in Saudi Arabia. If it can't, then it has to really safeguard its own values and its own principles and not award that tournament unless it can be clear that is not completely compromised by forced labour, by discrimination, by repression.
You mentioned Newcastle United. There was a recent report in The Athletic about Newcastle United's sleeve sponsor, a company called Noon, who are the Gulf's largest online retailer. And The Athletic also detailed allegations of serious worker mistreatment within that company's supply chain. Noon also has a relationship with Manchester City. It's a regional partner.
That's right. Noon is owned by the Sovereign Wealth Fund of the Saudi state, as is Newcastle. The way we approach it as a human rights organization, ultimately the Saudi state has responsibility for upholding human rights within its territory, and that includes regulating the businesses and enforcing the labor laws within its territory. And that could be whether it's a Saudi UAE company like Noon, or whether it could be Amazon, for example, an international company. We did an investigation at the end of last year that highlighted major, case of human trafficking at Amazon plants in Saudi Arabia. In a case like that, Amazon or Noon have their own responsibilities, but actually also the Saudi state does in terms of regulating the businesses that operate there. That applies whether that's a Saudi company, Indian company, a British company, or elsewhere.
You mentioned Saudi Arabia's broader investment in sport, and certainly from my own research into this area, it's clear that this is an area where they're both seeking to gain international prestige, as you say, global positioning. It's about geopolitics. It is also about building a future for itself beyond fossil fuel, isn't it? So whether it is boxing, whether it's Formula One, whether it's golf, whether it's football, Saudi Arabia has a lot of money. Money, we know, talks. Obviously, you're trying to use the power of argument and reason to try and at least ensure that human rights are improved in Saudi Arabia. But the sad assessment of the world as I see it at the moment is that too many governments, too many sports organizations just aren't interested. All they see are the dollar signs.
It's so obvious why so many sports are gravitating towards Saudi Arabia, because the money is on the table in quite unprecedented numbers. What's actually been quite interesting, I think, over the last 5 years, maybe slightly longer, has been a huge growth of demand from sports fans, from players, from athletes, to have more values within sport. You see so many more sports players and fans groups speaking out about values, becoming ambassadors for racial justice, for social justice, for, combating inequalities. That's really important. That's becoming a major part of the identity of sport. And I think that's at risk if we jettison those values too quickly. I think we've also seen in sports bodies, FIFA, the International Olympic Committee, and other bodies have now all adopted human rights policies, all these processes that, now there is an assessment of a country's human rights record before a World Cup is awarded. Now, is that applied in practice? Does it get overrun when there are bigger political and financial factors at play? That's clearly a major risk here. I think the sporting world is up against a major, major challenge in that. And I think the way that it needs to deal with that challenge is about having robust principles in place that are removable. It's not about saying no to every country, because sport is also supposed to be geographically inclusive, and sport is a major force within every region of the world. Within Saudi Arabia, it can be a progressive force for good as well, but it has to have some values at its core, and it's got to be able to navigate these challenges while not losing everything that people hold dear in sport, because it means a lot to us all, and it's not something we want to sell.
Indeed. And as you say, nobody's suggesting that individual countries should never have the right to host a World Cup, but there is a difference between rigorously investigating their human rights record and rolling over and having your tummy tickled by them, isn't there? I think some people might have been surprised, perhaps, if they've seen your report. You're raising concerns as well about the 2030 bid, Portugal, Spain, and Morocco, and then with also a South American component as well to mark the 100th anniversary of the first World Cup. And Morocco, you got concerns about because of its criminalization of same-sex relationships, but also of police brutality in Spain, for example.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of attention's on the 2034 World Cup in Saudi Arabia. We felt it's important to give equal attention and scrutiny to the 2030 World Cup as well, because they're both going forward at the same time. Every country in the world has human rights violations. That doesn't mean they're all at the same degree or the same level of gravity, but every country does. There's no perfect country in the world. And there are human rights risks in every tournament. And there are opportunities to improve things in every potential host as well. So we felt it was only fair to look at both tournaments together and apply the same principles and the same policies, which are international human rights standards and FIFA's own criteria and its own bidding regulations. So when we looked at Morocco, Portugal, and Spain, and we looked more at that than the other countries in South America, just because that's where most games are happening, there are a range of concerns there. There are labour rights concerns in all of the countries. Accident rates in Spain and Portugal are higher than the EU average. Levels of labour inspectors in Portugal are extremely low. And there are very high-profile cases of exploitation of migrant workers in Spain and Portugal as well. There was a big piece last year around exploitation of migrant workers on the Barcelona stadium, when there's big stadium renovations in the Nou Camp, and some really terrible conditions come up there. Countries in Europe are not immune to this, and it's just as important that we highlight this and drive progress there. In Morocco, in terms of labour rights, there's quite a bit of a crackdown on trade unions in there. There's a higher accident rate in the construction sector. We want to highlight this because if FIFA is planning a tournament there, if the Moroccan authorities are planning major infrastructure projects, which it seems like they are, then they need to put the workers' rights agreements right up front and do that before any problems are there. When we spoke to fans group in Spain and Portugal, the number one thing that came out in both countries was police brutality. It's quite extraordinary from an English fan to see images of riot police with guns for rubber bullets in stadiums, pointing at fans. It's quite remarkable. The Spanish police, I think, have got a bad reputation for domestic fans. And we've seen over the last few years, whether it's Arsenal fans being beaten, whether it is the experience of Rangers fans when they went to the UEFA Cup final a couple of years ago. They've got a very bad reputation in terms of the use of excessive force, in terms of not having any dialogue with fans, and treating fans as problem rather than the main client who's making football possible. And so that is something, when we spoke to fans, they said that needs to be addressed, both for the safety of fans at the tournaments, but also as a potential legacy. What they would say is, can we reset the relationship between fans and the security forces? So that's also a benefit there. So that came up very, very strongly from our conversations, as did, of course, other rights. You highlighted quite rightly that same-sex acts in Morocco are criminalized, and hundreds of people have been arrested for this in recent years. That's not the case in Spain and Portugal, but our partners who work on LGBT issues in Spain and Portugal report rising homophobic attacks in those countries in terms of social violence, not in terms of being criminalized. Other issues came up as well. How do you make sure a World Cup doesn't exacerbate the housing crisis in Spain and Portugal? There's big problems in some cities about huge amounts of people using Airbnb, pricing out local residents, evicting people from homes to make way for tourism. How do you make sure that this World Cup, when you might have 1 million fans visiting these countries from outside, how do you make sure that the World Cup doesn't make that worse? This doesn't mean that World Cup shouldn't happen there, but those are big things to consider.
Indeed, and I know that in Spain in particular, racism directed towards footballers has been a big issue. I suppose underlying all this, though, there will be a question, isn't there, which is that there are lots of problems in many parts of the world. To what extent is it football's responsibility to try and solve?
It's the right questions. And the way that we approach this is that if you were to rule out any country with had a human rights problem from hosting a World Cup, we wouldn't have a World Cup. And if I was to write a report around every human rights issue in a country connected to football or not, it would be a very, very long report. What we've tried to do in this is actually highlight the issues where a World Cup could exacerbate that issue, where violations could happen to people associated with the World Cup, whether that's fans, whether that's players, journalists, workers involved in stadiums. We've tried to keep the scope what is directly related to the World Cup itself. Therefore, there are things that FIFA can influence. Sometimes it can control, sometimes it can only influence. And there are things that the governments of the countries hosting the events need to address. A question like policing in Spain or Portugal or Morocco goes well beyond football. But there is a very football-specific element of that needs to be addressed for a World Cup. And look, if that can make a change to the broader policing in Spain and Portugal, then all the better.
Steve, thank you. That's Steve Coburn from Amnesty International. Steve's report is available to view in full at the Amnesty International website. I do recommend you go and have a look at it. I'd also recommend you as well to have a look at the report by Equidem. Equidem Research, looking at the standards for migrant workers and workers on stadiums in Saudi Arabia as well. I'm Adrian Goldberg. You've been listening to the Byline podcast. And just to remind you that if you want to support our work on this podcast, then the best way to do that is to take out a subscription to the Byline Times. That's our monthly newspaper, a monthly news periodical, which features the best of our online content and stuff that you can't read anywhere else. So head over, take out a subscription if you can, please, at bylinetimes.com. That's at bylinetimes.com. This has been a We Bring audio production by me and Harvey White for Byline Audio. That's the new audio arm of the Byline Times, and we're putting out some fantastic content at the moment. Byline Times Live, Americana with Hadit Matharu and Bonnie Greer, and Utter Bollocks with Otto English and John Mitchinson. So do check those out as well. Head over to bylineaudio.com. That's bylineaudio.com for our latest online audio offerings. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again very soon. But for now, cheers. Bye-bye.